Thank you all for coming. I'm waiting for a little bit of stability in the attendee number on the webinar. We'll get started in a minute. Okay, it looks like those are pretty stable. Thank you all for coming to the MIDAS seminar. My name is Libby Hemphill. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Millie Zimeta to speak to us today. She comes from the Open Data Institute, where she is the head of public policy. You may have recognized her background in philosophy from the talk notes that she provided ahead of time. And I can tell you, in our pre-meeting, we had an incredibly interesting conversation about data science and knowledge and what it means to be useful. And I am really looking forward to today's talk. I ask that you please post your questions to the Q&A in Zoom. And I will ask those questions during some interstitial moments that she has scheduled into her talk. And James, I'll turn it to you for upcoming events with MIDAS.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Libby. Everyone, if you just turn your attention to this slide, obviously we have, we're so happy that Millie is here, and we have continuing and exciting talks coming up in the MIDAS seminar series. And I'd also just like to take a moment and thank our sponsors that make this programming possible, which is Quicken Loans, now known as Rocket Companies, the American Mathematical Society, Microsoft, General Dynamics, and Yazaki. We actually have a week off from our seminar series. Our next talk will be on October 25th, and Tarun Yoshi is joining us from Wells Fargo. So with that, I'm going to disappear back into the background, and I'm going to share Millie's presentation here, and I'll turn the floor over to her. Oh, and Millie, we seem to have lost audio for you.
Thank you. I'm getting used to having both a headset and a kind of monitor. Can you hear me now?
Yes, brilliant.
Yes, great. Thank you. I was just saying thank you very much indeed, James and Libby, both for the very kind invitation to participate today, and also for the warm introduction. And Libby, yes, I really enjoyed speaking with you to brainstorm this session, and I hope that we can have as much fun with the wider seminar group as we had when we were planning it. I'm really looking forward to it. So the title of my talk today is Knowns and Unknowns, Data and Metaphor. And in the very short abstract and very abstract that we circulated just beforehand, we said that this session draws on Heracletius, Nietzsche, and Toni Morrison to explore what it means to do data science and data policy in times of uncertainty. And I thought that will, that's the audience for that's pretty self-selecting. So I'm really glad that you're all here. So next slide, please, James. So at the Open Data Institute, we're quite driven by our values, which are expert, enabling, and fearless. And we try to practice that day to day in our decision making, and then sort of thinking about how we approach our projects. And I've tried to bring that to bear on this session today. So I've thought about where I might have expertise, where I might be able to enable others, and what risks I might be willing to take or to support others in taking. So that's been very much at the heart of my thinking for today. Next slide, please. So here's an overview of the talk. I'll begin with some reflections. Then part one is mind the gap. Part two is mind end gap. And then we'll conclude with some reflections. And as Libby suggested, there'll be a break in between part one and part two, just to have any questions or brief discussion then. Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. So the reflections. So yes, as Libby said, my background's academic philosophy, and I did a bit of ancient Greek with that. And what I loved about ancient Greek was this is a language of kind of both farmers and mathematicians, right? So the word diagonal, I always remember it comes from diagonos, which means kind of, it's kind of it's the word for your elbow, right? And I love the fact that they've kind of got this very physical material imagination, then they use that to abstract out. So yeah, diagonos is two joints, sort of thinking about corners in your body. And I remember when I found out where epistemology, the branch of philosophy that deals with knowledge, comes from. It comes from the Greek word epistemi, that on which I stand, right? And that's just so concrete, but also so abstract. This is the kind of foundations of knowledge. It's what you literally stand on. And so that was about sort of 10, 15 years ago. And I had a similar sort of experience when I started working at the Open Data Institute last autumn. And I found out that the word data is the plural for the Latin datum, which means the given. And if you've done any epistemology, you know that the given is a very contentious topic indeed. But even if you haven't done philosophy, right, you know, think about all the assumptions in the given, and yet that's literally what data means. So my PhD was on philosophy of metaphor, and another thrilling discovery then was Nietzsche on truth and lies in a non-moral sense. And he has this idea that like all of language is a lie, like all of language is a metaphor. So it's a lie in the non-moral sense. So we've got all this empirical experience and we have to articulate it. And the way we do that is we just kind of like, we apply words to things in a kind of sort of proximal way, right? And in that way, you know, we try to translate reality and experience into thought, into language. So back to, you know, the kind of, you know, diagonal coming from diagonos, two corners, two joints. You kind of start with that very physical reality, you turn it into something abstract, and then you can communicate both your experience of the world, but communicate with other people. So that, for Nietzsche, is the process of metaphor. Metaphor turns reality into language, but it's a process of lying, and it's not an ethical thing or an unethical thing, it's just how thought works. So I just want us to bear that in mind when we think about data, because data is the given, it's a metaphor, you know, and we tend to think of it as, you know, kind of in epistemological terms, it's that on which we stand, but that on which we stand is itself a metaphor, it's a lie in a non-moral sense. So the question I want to leave you with just as we start is, data is a metaphor, what is it shaping? What is it articulating? And what is it hiding? Okay. So those are some reflections to begin with. Let's go to part one, mind the gap. So I think in the data justice movement, there's been a lot of focus on data gaps as a cause of inequality. And there you're thinking about, you know, when you don't have data about a community, that impacts the public services that can be provided for them, for example. And this was something that the current US administration tried to address with one of Biden's first executive orders in January 2021. And that was the executive order on ensuring a lawful and accurate enumeration and apportionment pursuant to the decennial census. That was about kind of accurate population counts, right? In order to make sure that there was a realistic sense of the size of a community to provide public services for them. So we know that when there's a data gap, that can cause inequality. But we also know that data gaps can be evidence or an indicator of inequality, right? So because there isn't infrastructure there, maybe there isn't infrastructure to collect the data, maybe other kinds of infrastructure hasn't been provided that would then generate data for collection. There you have a data gap. There's a sign that things aren't being provided there. So there the causality is the other way around. And this is something that the current US administration also tried to address in January 2021 with an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underrepresented communities through the federal government. And that was thinking about data as national infrastructure. So we have a similar view at the Open Data Institute that, you know, data is a public good and it's a form of public infrastructure. So data about your population, about your community is something that's, you know, that's needed for your society in order for your society to function properly. And so if there are gaps in that data, that's like having, you know, broken bridges and, you know, damaged train lines. So that's the kind of the two traditional views of data gaps in the data justice movement. But I want to challenge that. So next slide, please. So the question I have is, whose knowledge? And there's this wonderful quotation from Toni Morrison. I put it in full there. I came across this in 2014 with the first Black Lives Matter protests. Someone mentioned this 1975 lecture by Toni Morrison, A Humanist View, where she talks about, you know, she talks about there'll always be one more thing, one more way that you'll have to justify yourself, you know, to your oppressor, and none of it is necessary. It's all a waste of time. And I remember the sense of liberation I felt then, you know, just realizing that I don't have to get pulled into this game anymore. And I'm always grateful for Toni Morrison. It's never a mistake to read more Toni Morrison. But this bit also really struck me. I'm just gonna read it aloud if you bear with me. So she says, we judge intellect in several ways. One of the most important is by the ease with which it can tell the difference between one molecule and another, one cell and another, between a 1967 Bordeaux wine and a 1968. So it would seem that to continue to see a race of people, any race of people, as one single personality is an ignorance of Gothic proportions, an ignorance so vast, so public, and perception so blind and so blunted, imagination so bleak, that no nuance, no subtlety, no difference among them can be ascertained. In spite of improved methods of collecting and storing data and an increased amount of data available, with the exception of the deep probe of 3 or 4 historians, American scholarship has done virtually nothing to erase the ignorance that I have described. And what I love about that particular quote from Toni Morrison is she changes the direction of focus, right? So rather than thinking about the subjects of the data gaps, she turns her attention to those who have chosen to be ignorant. And if what she's saying is correct, it means that data collection for addressing ignorance is only part of the solution. There must also be a reckoning with the cause of the ignorance in the first place. This also makes me think of Eric Fromm in his work, I think it's in Fear of Freedom, when he talks about how contemporary knowledge is actually kind of secondhand knowledge, right? Because it's knowledge from approved sources such as, newspapers. Whereas maybe in previous civilizations, knowledge was embodied and acquired over time, knowledge of your environment. And yet modern society tends to think that what we have is knowledge and our predecessors were ignorant. But what that does is it actually, if you switch the lens around, it tells you something more about us than about the subjects of our judgment. Next slide, please. So I've asked the question, well, whose knowledge counts? But another question that follows for me is, well, what action follows from that knowledge or from that data? What insight? And here's why I think it's important to go to the cause of the ignorance in the first place, as Toni Morrison saying. So Friedrich Nietzsche, in The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, he anticipates a sort of, he predicts that modernity, that Western civilization will mistake knowledge for wisdom and pursue a kind of techno-scientific utopia where science and technology will solve all our problems. And he says the reason this is misguided is because we are the cause of our problems, So, famine exists in the world not because there isn't enough food, but because people are greedy, and people are cruel to other people. So this idea that, this techno-scientific redemption, this kind of, redemption redemption for the world through rationality and technology and science, he says it's misguided and doomed because there's a lack of self-confrontation in there. But particularly what I liked is his distinction between information and wisdom. So next slide, please. So just bringing it back to, in practical terms, sort of thinking, because not everyone in the room might be a philosopher yet, although I hope you will become one, but some of the people here might be data scientists. And actually, maybe this is perhaps more interesting for people who don't think of themselves as data scientists. But at the Open Data Institute, we have this quite holistic notion of data literacy. That involves thinking about the wider context of a data project. So we think that data skills are not just the traditional data science skills like data cleaning or quantitative analysis. We think that data skills in the broader sense includes relational skills, emotional intelligence, thinking about the context in which a data project is happening. So that kind of holistic critical intelligence about the context of the work that you're doing and the relationships around you. We think that's part of data literacy. But these are skills that we are not formally trained for in our modern techno-scientific society. And they're almost certainly not skills that we're trained for if you are pursuing a career in data science. And so I just wonder what the implications are of that, that that same kind of holistic critical intelligence that would allow you to question the nature of data gaps and what's behind them is not always what's taught when we pursue a career in data, in the given. Next slide, please. So just trying to bring this to bear on data justice movements. I think that for a data justice movement to be effective, it has to operate within certain parameters. And those parameters are kind of the traction of the political system that it's in, right? If it's effective, it's because it's got traction within the system that it's operating in. But there's an inherent risk there, which is that it's effective because it's replicating some of the blind spots of that system. It's accepting the given and recreating it. And so there's a really interesting paradox there, that in order to kind of do good and change the world for the better, you have to replicate some of the harm, perhaps, or at least you can't banish all of the harm immediately. But I think this is not a new problem or a new paradox. I think this is a classic problem of anyone who wants to work in policy. And it's something that any policymaker must reckon with, that your effectiveness and your traction as a policymaker depends on operating effectively within the flawed system that you're already in, and navigating within the bounds of the given. So I'll pause there. We'll have an interlude there just for some questions, maybe sort of five to 10 minutes. James, I wonder whether we should stop sharing screen just if people have their cameras on. I'm not sure if they do.
I don't think that anyone will really be able to, but on that note, if anybody is wanting to ask a question out loud rather than typing it in the Q&A box, please use the raise hand feature. I am able to unmute you at the very least, which will make it easier and perhaps a bit more interactive to ask questions during this interlude. And
I have one while we're waiting. We'll see if, no, I still just have a blank box. So you mentioned sort of reckoning with the reasons for the inequality in the first place. And I wonder if you can talk more about what it means to do that reckoning.
So for me, it's not so much reckoning with the reasons for the inequality, but reckoning with the reasons for the ignorance. So we talk about data gaps and we say, well, there's no data here. And I think, well, when did you realize that? How long did it take you to realize that data wasn't being collected, right? So that's what's more interesting to me, is the reasons behind the ignorance of the data gaps. But equally, it's thinking, well, when we say, oh, there's no data, there are data gaps, I think, well, whose data, right? Because the data is there for the community that's about, and for me, that speaks to Eric Fromm's point about, well, what counts as knowledge, right? So it's not like these people were just kind of like had no data and didn't exist until a policymaker decided that suddenly more data about them was needed, if you see what I mean. They always had data about themselves, but whether that data was recognized or kind of given status is another thing. So those are the dynamics that I'm perhaps more interested in. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. I think we have Sophia is up, and then I will ask a couple of questions that get posted in the Q&A. So go ahead, Sophia.
Correct. Yeah, Sophia, you should be able to unmute now.
Great, thanks. So yeah, I'm Sophia. I'm a first-year PhD student in philosophy at the University of Michigan, and I'm actually really interested in data ethics. That's why I'm in this class. And I was wondering what you think philosophers can do in order to sort of bridge the gap between what's classically studied in philosophy and these new ethical questions that are brought on by data.
I don't know, and maybe we'll get to some of this in the second half when we talk about maybe more from the perspective of a policymaker. Ethics was what got me into philosophy in the first place, right? Reading Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics is brilliant, and the way he writes is he's kind of writing for himself, so you're following him through his own mind, through his own thought processes, which is just really, I love it, but in the end, Aristotle decided that all the kind of great problems of society were tragic and that they can't be solved, or that each solution generates new problems, right? And I think, well, I wonder where that drive to think we can solve things comes from. I think that's back to what Nietzsche was saying about that kind of techno-scientific utopia and techno-scientific redemption from ourselves. Whereas actually, maybe the reckoning that needs to happen is with our own human nature. For Nietzsche, this was kind of, this idea if you kind of have Apollo and Dionysus, two kind of, parallel sort of forces or aspects, kind of Apollo, light, sunshine, prophecy, medicine, and Dionysus, kind of hedonism, kind of, ecstasy, and just quite sort of decadent, right? And for Nietzsche, what was great about ancient Greek culture was they recognized the importance of both. And then where he saw modern Western civilization going wrong, so we just kind of thought we could just get on with Apollo and ignore Dionysus. And he says, well, both aspects need to be recognized. I don't know if that quite answers your question, Sophia. I guess I share that Nietzschean skepticism that, we can redeem ourselves from ourselves, with rationality, technology, and science. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I mean, I think that then raises new questions, which is, well, if we can't redeem ourselves from ourselves, what is the job of a policymaker, and what is the job of a philosopher in this space, and what does that existential question mean in the context of data? And I said, to me, those are the questions that follow.
Thank you for your question, Sophia. I have two from the Q&A, so I'll start at the top. It says, I'm curious about the enabling aspect of the ODI values. Could you give us examples of local communities or grassroots groups that have been enabled to make choices for themselves using data and what that looked like?
Yeah, so it's an interesting tension because most of our work is with companies and governments, and this is a strategic choice on our part because they're the biggest stewards of data in an ecosystem, right? So if you can change how a company or a government operates, then you have the biggest influence in the ecosystem. But we try to use our platform and our position, that influence, to kind of give visibility to those who don't have the reach that we have. So we try to kind of work with the most powerful stakeholders while kind of advancing the causes of maybe those who might otherwise be excluded. So one of our recent projects was on inclusive data, and for that we convened communities who might not necessarily often have access to senior policymakers in government, or whose perspective might not be well understood, say, by industry. And so we kind of made sure that they had that platform, but also the richness of their perspective was included in our research. And that particular work was then quoted in the UK parliamentary research briefing. So we're kind of trying to, shift the record or shift what's considered good practice. In terms of data gaps, we try to support or give visibility to or platforms to organizations that do work with, I want to say community data, but then that raises questions about, well, who defines a community? I guess I'm thinking in terms of the kinds of communities or groups or aspects of our society which might not be on the radar of official government statistics. Or kind of the data that's collected by big tech, for exactly the reasons that we've just described. So we try to kind of find opportunities to work with them or give more visibility to their perspective.
Great, thank you. I think you asked me to keep time. I think it's time for part 2, but I see you 3 questions in the Q&A, and I will bring those back up at our next pause.
Okay, thank you, Libby. Okay, so part 2 of my presentation, this is called Mind and Gap. So part 1 was Mind the Gap, and here I'm thinking about the other aspect of the kind of, the gaps between perception and reality that metaphor can both reveal or hide. So I want to return to the idea of the given and what's needed for political effectiveness. And I think this is important both for data scientists who wish to have some kind of social impact for good, but also for policymakers, data policymakers, who wish to create frameworks so that data and digital technologies like AI can be used for good. So you've got to think about the given and being effective within the given. Next slide, please. So here's an example that I find very interesting. So my PhD was on metaphor and I finished it in 2007. And then in 2011, I came across this program by IARPA, the US Military Intelligence Research Program, called the Metaphor Program. And the metaphor program's aim was to, as it says in their own words, exploit the use of metaphors by different cultures to gain insight into their cultural norms. And the purpose of what they were, it was a call for kind of, it was both a funding and a collaboration opportunity around data collection and analysis of certain communities' metaphors, typically Middle East, North Africa. And one of the aims was for, I guess we'd call it espionage, in order to understand these communities by understanding their culture and their psychology, through the metaphors that they were using. Bearing in mind, my earlier comments from Nietzsche that, metaphors are our way of trying to articulate our world, right? But the second purpose was, I guess you might call it for infiltration. So first they wanted to understand the metaphors of this community. And then they wanted to give these communities new metaphors in order to shape or reshape their thoughts, so for political influence. And this was my first experience of seeing that my PhD topic in the humanities could be weaponized. So if you do a PhD in philosophy of art, you don't expect anyone to kind of, give you any power or take it too seriously. And yet, within a few years of graduating, here was the US military thinking about ways of weaponizing metaphor. And I felt quite ambivalent about it. On the one hand, I thought, what a fascinating topic. Can I join one of the consortia? Because I'd really love to do this work. I think it'd be, imagine putting my research into practice. On the other hand, I felt uneasy with these specific use cases. I thought, well, I don't really want to be spying on these particular communities. I don't really want to be trying to change their culture either. So I felt uneasy about the intended purpose. So it was interesting both to see the kind of military use case for my research in the arts and humanities, but also to see my own ambivalence about it. It wasn't a straightforward reaction. But this is something that I think anyone in data science is going to have to navigate, in particular because AI has been identified as one of the most strategic military technologies of the future, potentially our generation's equivalent of the nuclear weapon. So this is something that, it's when I was doing my PhD in philosophy of art, I thought there'd be no consequences from it, and I don't think that's a luxury or privilege that anyone kind of, doing a PhD in AI can have. Next slide, please. So at the Open Data Institute, we have this tool called the Data Ethics Canvas. And in the same way that our data skills framework tries to offer a critical perspective on what's needed in data skills, our Data Ethics Canvas tries to offer a set of critical questions about data projects. So it's just the questions you should ask yourself at the start or even before starting a data project that will help you think about the ethical implications of it. It's not guidelines, it's not rules, it's just questions. But then we tried to apply it. This time last year, we did a project around data for pandemic response. And we were trying to kind of access different sources of data from industry, civil society, and public sector in order to help inform an aspect of pandemic response. And we knew that the data had data gaps. We knew that it was flawed. So for example, some of the social media data, we knew that would have implicit bias in terms of not having data about people who might not have internet access, who might be excluded in that way, or people for whom their first language wasn't English, they might not be on that particular social media channel. So we were aware of the potential gaps in the data. And so we knew that any analysis that we did would be flawed, and the flaw might recreate existing social biases. But then the question we asked ourselves was not just what are the consequences of doing this research, including thinking about, recreating bias and harm and so on, but what are the consequences of not doing this research? When this is for pandemic response and we think we can do some good, it's not going to be perfect, but we think we can do some good. And we think we can, by articulating with humility our awareness of the flaws, we can try to mitigate some of the harm of it being imperfect. So this was a really difficult decision for us because our instinct is to kind of, I suppose if you know that you're at risk of recreating bias, you wouldn't normally want to do it, right? And yet here we had to ask ourselves, well, what are the consequences of not trying? And maybe that goes back to what I was saying about expert, enabling, and fearless. So it was challenging for us. So next slide, please. So in epistemology, we have this idea of Otto von Neurath's boat, Otto von Neurath's ship. So the idea is that you're in a boat in the middle of the ocean, and it has holes in it that you just have to keep patching up with other bits of the boat in order to stay afloat to get to your destination. So you can't go back and start again. You're just there in the middle of the sea. So you just patch up the hole here with a bit of wood from the mast, and then you patch up the hole in the mast with a bit of wood from the side, and so on. And so you just keep the boat afloat in order to try to get closer to your destination. And in epistemology, that on which I stand, the concept is relevant because you have to work with the flaws in your own conceptual scheme. You have to work with the fact that there is a given, and so your knowledge is not perfect, and you still have to build knowing that it's imperfect. So yes, this idea that you have to live with the not just live with the uncertainty, but live with the certainty that you're probably wrong. But I think that's also a useful way to understand policy. So if you're a policymaker, it's really important to know that government only intervenes when the market fails. So you're starting from a flawed foundation. You're starting because the market hasn't been able to solve the problem. And when you're acting as a policymaker, that almost everything you're going to do is going to backfire in some way, right? Because if it was a simple problem, it wouldn't need government. The market would solve it. So you have to just patch up one hole with the wood from another, and then create a new hole that then needs to be repaired, and so on. But you keep going because the alternative is worse, and you keep going because you are hopeful that you are making progress in your own kind of muddled way. And I think that the boat in the ocean, the holes in the boat, this is the given. And I think about, well, what skills are needed for that? And I think it's resilience, it's relationships, it's having a vision, but also getting people to kind of go with you on that journey, right? And again, these are skills that maybe we don't get trained formally. And I think this goes back to my earlier comments about data literacy. What are the things that aren't part of our education? Or what Eric Fromm would call, the kinds of knowledge or wisdom that was valued by previous civilizations or previous generations, and that we have discounted. Next slide, please. So why do I think this is important? So I think, well, we have a new given if you're working in data policy. And the new given is that you're going to have a lot more uncertainty than other areas of policy. So if you work in something like housing policy or, I don't know, transport policy, there's just a certain amount of evidence base that's been kind of, accumulated over years, maybe decades, and in some cases centuries, thinking about housing policy, right? So you've got an evidence base to work from. You've got roughly an idea of what kinds of interventions are roughly effective and in what ways. Data policy is new. There isn't that same evidence base to draw on. And sometimes the only way to get evidence or to generate evidence is to act. And then you'll find out what the consequences of that action are. So the new given, I think, for me, working in data policy, is that uncertainty, large-scale uncertainty, is the given. The other consideration for me is that as a society, we face new challenges. We've seen with the pandemic, with health security, just the way that kind of, the kind of cross-border implications of that. Climate security isn't something that can be, confined within borders, nor can one country act alone on it. So we're going to have to find new ways of kind of solving problems, new ways of using data to solve these problems that previous generations didn't have in quite the same way. AI itself is potentially both a solution, but potentially also a challenge. So these are the new things that we're going to have to navigate, and that's why I think those skills, that kind of being able to navigate uncertainty, is going to be really important. And here's something I love from Richard Rorty. So this is from Contingency, Irony and Solidarity, where he talks about language and particularly metaphor and its role in shaping the world and giving us new frameworks, new ways of imagining our world. And he sees this as essential work that everyone should be doing. And he says, look, to fail as a poet, and thus for Nietzsche, to fail as a human being, is to accept somebody else's description of yourself. To execute a previously prepared program, to write at most elegant variations on previously written poems. So the only way to trace home the causes of one's being as one is would be to tell a story about one's cause in a new language. So that's his call for new metaphors and for choosing to make the metaphors that you live by. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just some concluding reflections. So one of Nietzsche's favorite philosophers was Heracletius, the pre-Socratic, and he saw paradox in everything, but that paradox was a productive and creative tension. So for example, the way up is the way down. If you think about, a mountainside, right, the way up is also the way down. And that which joins and that which divides is one and the same. So think about a national border or river. It both joins the two things on either side of it, but divides them, right, by existing between them. So he saw this in nature, and for him it was a way of understanding our social reality too. And it's, metaphors reveal truths that are hiding in plain sight. This talk has been structured in two halves that make a complementary pair, and they pull in slightly different directions, like a metaphor, to create a productive and dynamic stasis. So it's just that creative tension, I think, exists between and around them. I haven't offered solutions. But I've offered, I suppose, a metaphor or a way of thinking, a metaphoric way of thinking. And I think being comfortable with that discomfort is an important policy skill. Being comfortable with that ambiguity and the fact that it's not stable, the meaning isn't stable, is part of what you do in policy. So if this talk has been a metaphor, I leave it to you to determine what it has been a metaphor about and what the meaning of that metaphor might be. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I realized I was clapping, but I'm sitting alone in a little Zoom room. I appreciate your comments, and while folks are adding questions to the Q&A, I'll go back to some that were posed earlier. So one of them says, I'm really interested in how you think about drawing a distinction between information and knowledge, and whether you could give an example about how you or the ODI might deal with that distinction in practice.
I think that word practice is really key, and thank you for the question. I don't think anyone else can tell you where that line is between knowledge and wisdom, right? And part of the evidence of wisdom is exercising that judgment about where that line is, and knowing when knowledge is not sufficient or is not complete, or deciding what to do with the knowledge you have. I'll tell you something that happened to me when I first started working at the Open Data Institute that really influenced, I guess, my own practice. So one of the things that we try to advocate for is a trusted and trustworthy data ecosystem. And in my first week or so there, one of my mentors said to me, look, we're not going to get a trusted and trustworthy data ecosystem through technology or, through more and more evidence. The technology has been there, for years, and no one would dispute the arguments. He said, the way we build the world that we want to see is by being trusted and trustworthy ourselves. And it was really important for me to hear that because I began to understand, well, I have to be the ambassador for the things that I'm saying are possible with data, right? So it was just that, again, that moment of illumination, insight that, the way to get others to trust what we're saying or to trust in our vision is for them to trust us as individuals. So that's something I've really appreciated, learning from the ODI and try to take forward. Does that help or answer the question?
So he followed up in chat and says, yes, thank you. I think we have a question coming from a participant out loud. James, if you could allow Angela Shupka-Gonzalez to unmute, that would be great.
I absolutely can. Angela, if you could please use the raise hand feature just so I can find you in the list, that would be awesome. Perfect, thank you. And now you should be able to unmute.
Thank you, and thank you for your talk today. I'm so thrilled and excited. I was curious about whether you notice among data policymakers and data scientists that you work with an interest and desire to learn to be with the discomfort and uncertainty you've mentioned.
Thank you, Angela. I don't know, because I can't speak for others. I guess what I detect is just a real sense of responsibility and our understanding that the way AI could become either a significant force for good or a significant force for harm, and just a real taking that responsibility seriously and just really trying to just be very sort of thoughtful about that. One of the projects that we're doing at the moment at the ODI is called Experimentalism in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in that, we're trying to explore what are the conditions needed for organizations to be comfortable experimenting, because I think we're just going to have to get used to experimenting all the time, right? And that's been really interested there to kind of hear about attitudes to failure and the relationship with failure within an organization and so on. I think one of our roundtable participants said that one organization they'd worked at had tried to give prizes for failure in order to encourage more kind of, more of that resilience. And in the end, people just kind of started nominating really, really successful projects that had one really minor flaw, because they didn't want to be on the record with having major problems. So it's really hard to get people to talk about what went wrong and what they regret and so on. So I think there's an awareness of the need for it, but how do you do it, and how do you? I think resilience is key. How do you support individuals, organizations, communities recovering from when a mistake is made or when something doesn't work as well as hoped for?
Many thanks.
I have a pair of somewhat more concrete questions following Angela's. So the first is, how can these ODI values direct data gathering and experimental processes in scientific fields that may be rife with similar assumptions and obfuscation? So this came from your earlier part of your talk, but looking at sort of what can we take away?
Thanks, that's a really interesting question. And if I've understood correctly, it's saying, well, how can what we're learning and doing in the field of data policy and data science almost kind of be reverse engineered to maybe traditional scientific fields and disciplines? That's really interesting, and I hadn't thought of that, and I'm glad you've raised it. I mean, that would be very interesting if the things that we normalize in data policy and data science then shift the boundaries for other disciplines, in terms of experimental approaches. I don't know how we'd go about doing that, because it's not something that I had aspired to before. But I would encourage you, since it's something that you have identified as an opportunity, which shows that you've got the perceptiveness, to kind of to see the opportunity and the need. I would encourage you to think about how you can take it forward. There's a really great clip. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Stuart Hall. There's a really great clip on YouTube. If you Google Stuart Hall and Obama presidency, it's a 4-minute clip of him talking about the Obama presidency, and he says, well, he quotes Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And he says, well, that means you've got to understand the bloody system, and you've got to understand how it works, understand all the things that are geared against you, because only then can you identify what levers can you pull, what things can you push, what kind of, movements can you attach yourself to. So I would say, since you've identified something really, quite interesting and potentially high impact, that you identify what are the current contradictions, cracks, and opportunities in our current system, in the given, that you can use to best effect.
Thank you for that question. It was from an anonymous attendee, so I'm not sure who just received that challenge, but I hope they run with it. And we have another anonymous question, which is, as future data scientists, what factors should we consider while designing data-driven decision systems so that these systems are as fair as possible?
So thank you for the question. I'm afraid I can't answer it. We haven't managed to design fair systems in the world, we live in now. And I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, both Aristotle and Nietzsche. Aristotle said, even when you try to solve every problem, each of your solutions will generate new problems. And that's the nature of ethics and politics, right? It's tragic. So he didn't think there could be progress in ethics or politics, because you were just in this dynamic stasis, as Heracletius might say. And it's back to what my interpretation of Nietzsche. You can't sort of change human nature through this techno-scientific redemption. So we haven't managed to create a fair world, and I don't think we will anytime soon. So I think the really interesting and important question might be a different one, which is, well, what's different about these data-driven systems, or what's different with digital technology? And given that we can't change, or we might not be able to change human nature, and given that solutions will create new problems, what do we do about that as it applies to data and digital technology? That to me is the question.
Thank you. I see we have time for 1 or 2 more questions if folks have them. So I'll wait a minute to see if anyone has something else they want to ask. James, I see there's one raised hand. That.
Perfect. Yeah, Benny, you should be able to talk now.
Hi, thank you. This was such an interesting talk, and I have a lot of interest in sort of how the humanities and computer science and data science can overlap. So it's exciting to hear you addressing that. And I wanted to bounce off of the idea that you were just most recently talking about how solutions can create new problems. And it seems like that's a dynamic that is rife within technology specifically, or at least it seems like something that people are becoming more aware of or keen to, and it's I was wondering if you could think of any like examples of companies or policymakers that handle how companies and policymakers can handle essentially like looking proactively looking to mitigate the potential harms that the technologies they are making can produce, if that makes sense.
I think it's a good question. So one of the but I think it's difficult, you know, because I'm just thinking T.S. Eliot, you know, youth is cruel and laughs at situations it cannot see, right? We can't anticipate all the consequences of our actions. And again, that's what interested me about the IARPA metaphor program, you know, that sometimes some really beneficial things have come out of weapons science, beyond weapons, defensive weapons themselves, right? So it's, you don't know how things will evolve over the years and over the decades, and what the consequences will be. And sometimes the consequences are in domains, you know that seem tangential for now. And I think, again, coming back to Nietzsche's idea of this techno-scientific redemption, he would say part of the problem is that we think that there is a utopia that can be created, right? Whereas maybe if you accepted some failures are inevitable, or that, you know, we have to kind of, both the Apollo and Dionysus have to coexist, right? Both our capacity for kindness and our capacity for cruelty. Once you know, or that, because Dionysus was also the kind of god of, you know, sort of, he wasn't malicious, it was just that chaos surrounded him, right? So, you know, the kind of Apollonian structures would just kind of, you know, be ruined around him. So it's just this kind of, what would happen if we understood that's maybe a natural consequence of being human, that the things we build might sometimes fail or are vulnerable to failing over time, or, you know, to mistakes and so on. So I think at the heart of it for me, Benny, is that idea that we can somehow rationalize ourselves out of this. And maybe if we kind of confront that this is, it's just a consequence of being human, maybe our relationship to it would change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Rather than keeping on thinking of solutions all the time, we'll think, well, you know, you can't, what's the solution for being a human?
Right. Yeah, that's a great response. Thank you.
I really like Richard Rorty on this, you know, thinking about contingency, irony, solidarity, because he says, look, you can't argue people into an ethical position. What you do is you build solidarity, right, through empathy. So that's it. I think that, again, coming back to that emotional intelligence and relational intelligence, I think if your relationships are strong, then the relationship is resilient to survive, you know, harm or mistakes. And so I'm just thinking it's interesting that we tend to go to the rational, you know, what's the rational solution to prevent mistakes happening? Whereas maybe if we consider, well, what's the, you know, if we had the resilience and the kind of relational strength, maybe the mistakes wouldn't matter so much.
Yeah, I think that's a great outlook. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
And we have one final question to wrap us up from anonymous attendee that says, what are your thoughts on changing the education landscape to train folks in the future for working in the ODI kind of space? Since this is a highly multidisciplinary endeavor that definitely needs more folks working together.
I wouldn't want to limit it to working in the ODI space. There are lots of spaces to explore, new spaces to make, and I would want the next generation to be showing me the way, you know, and showing me new things that I don't know yet. So I don't want them to emulate what we're doing. So fearless, expert, enabling. I want to enable them to do something that we don't yet know about.
Thank you so much. I think, James, do you see any other hands raised? I think we've addressed all the cues in the Q&A.
Correct. Yeah, I don't see anything else raised at this moment. We do have a few minutes left if anyone wants to ask one final one. Otherwise, all right.
I guess, Millie, we'll give you a chance to let us know where can people learn more about what you're up to. If you want to post the slide again, James, at the end, or if you want me to post your Twitter handle, or how you'd like me to invite folks to see what you're doing next.
Yeah, sure, that would be great. So the Open Data Institute, I think our website is odi.org. Or no, it's the ODI, theodi.org. And also on Twitter is ODIHQ. So some of the projects I've been mentioning, one is called Inclusive Data. Another one is called Experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And that's quite new. We just started in July, and I'm really excited by it because it's got 3 work streams, and we've named each work stream after a science fiction writer. The idea is there from Frederick Jameson, who said that, you know, sci-fi, speculative fiction, is the genre of utopia and dystopia, right? It tells us about our own fears and aspirations. So we've got 3 work streams, each named after a sci-fi author. The Isaac Asimov work stream looks at experimentation in the UK. And then the Ursula Le Guin work stream looks at experimentation by minority communities in Europe and North America. So rather than seeing them as kind of victims of you know, digital technologies and data, thinking about the ways in which they're leaders and pioneers. And for me, that's really inspired by the way Toni Morrison, like, you know, I don't think she ever saw herself as a victim, you know, and it's the ways in which she just kind of, you know, just recognize her own leadership, right? So that's the Ursula Le Guin work stream. And then the Octavia Butler work stream is kind of applying that same thinking to international development in the global south. Again, thinking about the ways in which they are global leaders and they are pioneering, and the ways in which they can harness digital technologies to leapfrog traditional models of, you know, economic development. So that's our project, Experimentalism and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The other sources, I think I provided them there. So Nietzsche, Truth and Lies in an Unmoral Sense, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, Toni Morrison, A Humanist View, and Richard Rorty, Contingency, Irony, Solidarity. I was just thinking, yeah, the Open Data Institute's Data Skills Framework and Data Ethics Canvas are free to download on our website, so do have a look at those too. Thank you for the opportunity, Libby, just to, you know, name my sources, and James, if it would be helpful, I can add a list at the end with the links or something.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I can incorporate that into our recording. So if anyone wants to go back and reference any of this, this talk has been being recorded, and I have moderate editing skills, so I can add all that information in if I miss the slides. So
great. And I see we're basically at time. Millie, thank you so much. Your talk was everything that I had hoped for, and I leave the talk having learned and being curious. And thank you so much for your time. And for everybody who attended today, we hope to see you again at a future MIDAS seminar, and we appreciate your attendance and attention.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it. It's such an honor to be here today, and I've really appreciated the questions and the kind of thought-provoking comments. Thank you.
perfect. Thanks so much, everybody.